This video is an edited version of a Skype interview that I did that focuses on the use of abstraction as a tool for photographers to use in order to communicate with the viewer in a different manner. So instead of providing purely rational information, one is using color, form, line, and shapes in order to communicate on more of an intuitive level. Abstract art is generally considered to have its origins in the 19th century, but one can argue that even cave painters understood its utility. I chose to borrow the painterly approach of abstraction as well as other techniques for this essay. In order to explain why I adopted this approach, I need to provide some context to the subject matter. I had for many years photographed the inner city of Johannesburg, particularly how the city had transformed from its pre-apartheid state through to the present day. Over the years, the area has become overpopulated, unmanageable, and very run down. And at the time of taking these images, the country was imploding due to corruption, crime, and mismanagement. And I'd all but given up hope of my homeland achieving Mandela's dream of a prosperous rainbow nation. I didn't want to focus on the harsh realities of this area using, say, documentary or journalistic approaches. And I didn't want to create a formal narrative. I was more interested in conveying how I felt while being in these spaces and communicating that in a lyrical manner. In 2013, I won the Ernest Cole Award and was pretty much given free rein to experiment with my approach. The project would result in a traveling exhibition and book with the title A City Refracted. This title reflects the altered vision that I had adopted, as well as the fragmented nature of the city itself. In 2014, a selection of the images was included in the Aperture Foundation Summer Open held in New York. During this interview, we looked at 4 images from this essay. This is the first image. As I was walking through the city with my bodyguards, I was on the lookout for a combination of elements that I could work with. In this case, I saw the pink cutout outside a filling station. I noticed that the garage attendant was moving about as he attended to his customers, so I found a position in which I could capture his shadow as it fell on the cutout. Then, in the background, there was a movement of vehicles as they stopped at the traffic light. This shot came together when a minibus taxi driver was waiting at the exchange and a colourful bus was in the adjacent lane. It was only later that I noticed that there was a reflection of a woman standing on the curb that appears in the red circle. In order to stack these layers of colour in a two-dimensional frame, I used a slightly longer lens, which results in the compression of the foreground and background, therefore limiting a feeling of depth of field. This convergence of the elements creates a sort of colourful combination of shapes, and if you blur your eyes, it becomes a kind of colour field abstraction. And this new abstracted form allows the viewer to interact with the image in the more intuitive manner that I was talking about before, because they aren't merely focusing on the actual content. Texture is also really important within abstraction because it provides separation between the individual shapes and gives independent visual interest, stopping the colors just blending into each other and becoming a bland graphic design. In the case of this image, the scratch marks on the pink cutout appear at the intersection where the head of the shadow appears, and the shape of these marks is repeated in the background again in the shape of the bus tires. The head of the shadow and that of the bus driver are pointing in the same direction, so there's a nice twinned repetition there. The expression on the taxi driver's face and the reflection of the woman in the body of the vehicle also ground the image because it becomes something that is real and one can relate to, as opposed to just a combination of colorful inanimate objects. One thing I obviously had no control over was the limited color palette. It consists of mainly reds, oranges, and pinks with various shades of blue. And there's a little streak of yellow that appears at the point where the cutout hand is pointing. I chose this image for the cover of my book, and it was also used as the opening spread in the World Atlas of Street Photography, published by Yale University Press. This photograph was taken in Hillbrow, which is a densely populated area with high-rise blocks of flats. And I was inside of what remains of a very popular Italian restaurant, which is now a kind of rundown bar come disco, in which the windows have been painted black. The two men on the left and right of the frame were outside the restaurant, standing on a red balcony. And the image of the woman in the top middle left is a reflection of a television set which was inside the room. The vertical black windows split the frame up into fragments of color, similar to a collage. Within the fine art world, there's a practice of tearing off segments from a layered poster stack. The result is this medley of blended colors. There's no way of knowing which color relates to which poster, but the end result is a new abstracted artwork in which the colors form an interplay which is really engrossing, and one gets a sense of the passing of time as the different layers pop up across the image. It's full of illusion, and there's no resolution to this puzzle. The newly created pattern is kind of the end in itself. Getting back to this image, if one moves from the left to the right through the photograph, one's eye shifts between light and dark or positive and negative space without getting a sense of depth. This makes a photograph impenetrable because it's unresolvable. So one's eye settles back onto the two-dimensional plane and it explores it anew as a fragmented abstraction. This image was taken inside a hijacked building. What that means is that someone has unlawfully taken over the building and has rented out spaces, mainly to illegal immigrants. This particular building had been mothballed for many decades, so there were very few services available to tenants, and the lifts or elevators still had apartheid signage, which had obviously been removed from all other buildings well before 1994, when South Africa became a democracy. The one said Europeans only and the other said non-Europeans only. And it was probably the best example of moving on from the past, because the immigrant tenants probably didn't speak English and probably weren't aware of the significance of the signs. So they were rendered redundant. I was working with 3 bodyguards so that I could move around freely both during day and night. So we just decided to explore this building and came across this particular space in which a foreign tailor had set up shop. It also served as a living space for his fairly large family. He had found these curtains somewhere and hung them up against the window to create some sense of privacy. This image works very similarly on the abstracted level as the previous one because of the flattening effect. The limited and muted color palette has allowed us to see the image on a two-dimensional plane. So the curtains, the window details, and the building behind have merged into the single muted color plane. If you just slightly blur your eyes, you'll see that the shapes start becoming the dominant visual feature. Unless you really interrogate the background, you don't take a lot of notice of the details. It's interesting, though, that Once one starts to focus on the central window, it breaks the abstraction and you start to feel the possibility that that darkened window could be slightly ominous, and you're reminded of the dangers of living in the inner city. The geometry of the composition allows one's mind to settle. Again, the shapes are vertical, and the background window is central within the frame, while these diagonal lines provide another level of interest and texture. This is the final image that we're going to look at, and it has a very different form of abstraction from the others. I was exploring a building and saw these very strange markings against the white wall. I immediately thought of a Cy Twombly painting. I first tried close-up, but it came across as really one-dimensional. As I moved back, the shape of the worn balustrade slipped into the potential photograph, providing a perfect second abstract diagonal shape, which was then reinforced by the red stairs. The very structured diagonal lines of the balustrade offsets and in a way contains the disorder of the black markings behind. When I walked further up the stairway, I found that there had been a tire manufacturer on the top floor. And what they had done is roll these tires down the stairway, and each tire left its mark over the years. This repetition of shapes then evokes a feeling of the passing of time. So much of abstract painting comes down to mark making and how the character of these marks relate to each other and how they integrate harmoniously. The vanishing perspective of the red stairs, in the case of this image, adds a valuable separation between these very different abstract elements. With all four of these images that we've spoken about, when they are sequenced within an exhibition or book, they appear as abstractions, but they don't really contribute on the information level. They simultaneously disrupt the idea of a narrative and contribute to the overall lyricism of the essay. For me, they represent visual fragments that I've interspersed within my broader view of this fragmented city. I've put together a selection of images from the book that illustrates my use of painterly devices to achieve the lyrical aesthetic that I was after. These devices include movement, blur, the use of color fields, as well as ambiguity. I hope that you enjoyed this video. Please like and subscribe because it really helps me, and I'll see you next time.